I guess people really liked that last video, huh? After Noct, there was a need to experiment and see what worked well with the game mode that had just begun. From onwards, the game expanded the scope of its focus, with maps becoming far more extensive, or focusing on each map's innovations. In some circumstances, they try to accomplish both, and in more rare cases, they managed to handle both perfectly well. As Treyarch was trying to perfect their craft, bits and pieces of the ideas they had for the mode would fall by the wayside, either to be revisited in the future, or never show up again, and only remain in one singular map. It doesn't just apply to zombies too, but also to the general games Treyarch makes. Sometimes they introduce fantastic or interesting ideas but end up tossing them away for various reasons, kinda like throwing shit to a wall and seeing what sticks. One of these ideas they had was the approach to horror in the early maps. Noct began in a creepy dark bunker, and it set the tone in the establishment of gameplay that'd be used in World at War and up until around Ascension and Black Ops 1, where Easter eggs would slowly take center stage. And a massive chunk of those dark themes would never get revisited appropriately throughout the series, even if there were games that sure try to be as good as World at War and ultimately failed, like World War II and, the other game. The game that spawned this entire series to begin with. I'm not gonna say its name. Due to this, World of War is in a unique position, especially when it comes to zombies. In my last video about Noct, I discussed the beginning of the game mode and the reveal of zombies, and gave my thoughts and opinions on the map. One critique I gave to the map was how I felt that there were maps that did what Noct tried to do, and did it a whole lot better. Funnily enough, one of the maps I was referring to was the map right after Noct, and it's the map that I'll discuss in Chapter 2. Of this long series.
Here they come! They're everywhere! Shit!
The introduction to Verrückt begins differently from Noct. Instead of not knowing where you are, you're told exactly where your location is and the date. And yet, as you explore the remnants of the destroyed asylum, you'll notice it's devoid of any life, showing the aftermath of the initial outbreak. The game even shows this by some of the doors being closed off, or a short defense in a room with an expensive machine gun. Now, despite the fact that this is World at War and some of the graphics are, well, not that great, I feel like the primitive graphics add something to Verrückt, not necessarily in gameplay, but just with how it's stylized. It looks like something where your brain kind of tries to compensate for how horrible the textures look. Later versions of Verrückt would add better lighting and better textures, so later editions would take away that aspect of the map. But that said, with some parts of the map, your brain is kind of left to pick up the pieces of what happened here. There's a dentist chair that if you interact with, you'll hear the sound of drilling and screaming. And as you explore the map, some of the darkest moments in the history of humanity are shown to you, one bit at a time. Now, visuals and sound alone can be effective to scare players, but if it was just that, the effect would just wear off by future replayings of the map. Because of that, Verrückt does something unique by creating a far more threatening enemy in gameplay than in Noct. But we'll get into that later in this video. Beginning the map, the spawn rooms you can begin in are quite small, both together probably being something around the size of Noct's spawn room, but divided in half. Not to mention, Verrückt is one of the more unique maps in the series in how it handled spawning, by giving you the chance to either spawn in two rooms, and if you're playing with a team, instead of spawning all together, your teammates will spawn in the other room. Meaning you're stuck with one other person, or just yourself if you're playing with 3 players. In a way, the map in the early beginnings solidifies the feeling of isolation. And while maps later on, like Shinonuma and even Noct before, would have traces of that feeling of isolation, not only does Verrückt have that feeling in gameplay by taking away half of your teammates, but by also the outside of the map, by showing a destroyed town nearby. And most semblance of life outside the map, like the burning forest, is turned to ash In Noct, the zombies kind of came out of the trees, or the fog. But with the absence of the fog and the inclusion of the burning forest, it's as if the developers are just trying to say that the experience won't be anything like Noct. Not to mention, the map is quite bright. Instead of a giant supernatural moon, you instead see a burning countryside and a sun shining far away. In a way, Verrückt is kind of unique in that aspect. It's one of a couple zombie maps that take place in daytime, and it's impressive that Verrückt manages to be as horrifying as it is, while similar maps that would take place in daytime would be maps like Shinonuma, Shangri-La, the early parts in Moon, or later in Black Ops 3, Gora Krovi, to name a few. And while some do have that horror aspect in the way they look and how they handle it, Verrückt and also Shinonuma is the only one that remains truly horrifying despite the change. This works in multiple ways, not just to show the difference from Noct, but also to use lights to lead the player to any points of interest, whether it be barricades or stuff that the map innovated on. For example, Juggernog, one of the 4 perks that Verrückt would introduce, is in the brightest part of the spawn room. It also helps with the progression of the map, with the light leading you towards the staircases. And because of the coloring and lighting of the map, most players will be able to spot power and know that they're closer to completing the first stage of progression, which is to turn the power on. This isn't unique to Verrückt. Noct does this as well for the mystery box, and the 2 areas you can go to, the help room or the staircases. By the time you finally do turn the power on, by this point you're left in your own choice as to what you want to do, either to prioritize perks or your weaponry. But with that, this leads us to the gameplay section. While Noct was a simplistic challenge, Verrückt is one of the most difficult maps in the entire series, if not the most difficult if you exclude future remasters. You're usually in a tight squeeze on the map and must actively be in the moment to go through the rounds. It's for that reason you have to be careful with how you go about the early setup, because if you're stuck on round 15 with an M1 Garand, you're probably not even going to make it past round 18 unless you're really good at the game. Verrückt introduces the PPSH. The PPSH is one of the best guns in World of War, so good in fact that it disappeared from zombies until Gora Krovi. To know how far of a difference that is, Verrückt came out in 2009. Gora Krovi came out in 2016. And I know this is unrelated, but I don't have many opportunities to say this, so I just need to say this for the sake of my sanity. There's legitimately no reason for the PPSH to not be in Black Ops 1. You might say that it wouldn't fit the other Black Ops guns, or that they'd have to add it to the game, which is fair enough of a point if it weren't for the fact that it's literally in the campaign. I shit you not, the PPSH is literally here, coded, textured, and everything. They even changed the sound of the gun, and they never brought it back to the World of War maps. So, in my opinion, there's legitimately no excuse for it. Hell, all of the World of War weapons in Black Ops 1 are literally ported over from World at War. It's just a case of Treyarch being lazy, and I hate it. Now, the reason why I'm really passionate for this gun is because I love it. This gun and the PPS-43 are 2 really cool looking guns, and I love Soviet guns as well. They fit in zombies, and yet instead of bringing those 2 really cool guns, they instead added the Law, the China Lake, and created the Winter's Howl, 3 of some of the worst guns ever. They even cut the AK-47 from Black Ops 1 and added it to Mob, where it's legitimately my favorite gun on that map. The PPSH is an amazing gun, and I almost always grab it when I get the opportunity to from the box. And this gun, alongside the Thompson, are what I usually use to help me get to the high rounds. Verrückt would also add wall buys for the MP40 and the STG, both being really useful early on, but Verrückt would also add bouncing Bettys. In a way, they basically allow you to set up your own proper defenses without relying on your firearm, and you can place a bunch of them per round. There's also a glitch you can do with the bouncing Bettys that allows you to get 3 to 6 weapons at once, though I personally never do it whenever I play Verrückt. With that in mind, Verrückt generally expands on the weapon count and even includes something to properly defend yourself, which sounds great if it wasn't for a big issue that Verrückt failed to tackle. The zombies get stronger and your weapons get weaker, meaning while Verrückt added all these cool weapons, they only mean to help you in the early game, and by the time you reach the actual high rounds, you no longer can rely on them to help you, and you need to utilize traps to even have a chance to get to the next round. Part of the horror in Noct is how much the zombies were a threat to the player. And while a good player can conquer the map by training and using the flamethrower, Verrückt tries to prevent that from happening because the zombies are even more of a threat, not just from sounds and visuals, but by the difference in speed. By round 6, some zombies can spawn in as sprinters, running just as fast as the player, and the only way to outrun them is if you sprint, but they'll probably catch up to you quickly, effectively meaning that there could be a single moment where you don't see any zombies near you, and before you know it, you've been cornered cornered and downed. And while the zombies aren't as scary as the zombies in Knocked in terms of audio, especially since they look the same in terms of models, they more than make up for it in gameplay, as they're a lot more aggressive and alongside the sprinters can kill you fast if you're not careful or fail to glitch them out. But again, remember, it's World of War. Zombies can only hit you if you're standing still, so you could just keep sprinting in place or just prone or crouch, and you can escape out of a horde or even getting cornered. But let's just ignore that for now for the sake of giving the map a chance. In an attempt to give a semblance of a chance for the player, Treyarch added perks, which would be one of the more important innovations Verrückt would add to the entire series. Now, despite the addition of 4 brand new perks, in Verrückt there's only 2 that you actually need, which is Juggernog and Speed Cola. But even with that, the addition of perks end up becoming only useful in the early rounds or on certain strats. Juggernog in Verrückt increases your health regeneration insanely high, and while that seems like a good thing, because of the black hole effect the zombies have, if you get cornered at all, effect is basically useless, either leaving you to perform a glitch to dodge the zombies cornering you, or your game is practically over. I'm not saying it's useless, because it's absolutely necessary, but in comparison to future maps, Juggernog has an amazing ability, but ends up becoming underhanded by the fact that zombies are even more of a threat. And because of the fact its weapons become useless in the later rounds, Speed Cola is necessary in the early rounds, but falls out of use as well. Once camping becomes no longer viable and you're forced to train on one of the most tightest maps in not just World of War, but zombies as a whole, Speed Cola is still partially useful, but again, similar to Juggernog, not as useful in the later rounds. Perks are widely regarded as the crowning achievement of Verrückt, and while perks would later be a large piece of the zombies formula, on Verrückt they're necessary to get, but end up not being that useful in the end. Later maps would use those perks in better ways and not fall into the same issue as the zombie speed got reduced and your weapons got more powerful. If you got cornered once in Verrückt, it's basically game over for you, just like on Knocked. While Verrückt tried really hard to be different from Knocked, its gameplay ends up becoming essentially the same cycle of Knocked. Instead of using the flamethrower, you use traps. It boils down to the same thing. You get cornered once, you're dead. Get snuck up on, you're dead. The way you die is generally the exact same way as on Knocked. Now, while I praise Knocked for that level of realism, on Verrückt, while I do like it, the addition of perks was supposed to prevent that from happening. They, in my opinion, failed to do that. While the end result is that the zombies end up becoming more of an active threat in gameplay, it also ends up making the map to be more difficult, with some people considering it to be the most difficult map in the entire series next to 5 and Call of the Dead. And it gets worse once you realize this is months after Knocked, the first zombies map ever. Needless to say, while I'm sure some people enjoyed the map, Verrückt was full of flaws online and was placed way too early in the series. For some people too, it's usually considered as one of the worst maps in World of War for a number of reasons, the sheer challenge being one of the more bigger reasons as well. And while the challenge adds on the horror of the map in my opinion, due to the threat in gameplay, it can cause people to not be interested or want to play when the odds are stacked way too against them. Now, from the way I like to view it, the early World of War maps were attempts to fix a specific problem in the gameplay that Knocked established. Verrückt added mini upgrades for the player, and would add a more refined progression system that Doris would later utilize and perfect. But there still was a lingering issue of arming the player with something that could be utilized in the much higher rounds. And because Verrückt failed to fix that with its additions, the innovations ends up falling underhand. Instead of relying on your weapons, like in literally every other zombies map, you need to rely on traps, which are placed on 2 really awkward locations. I mean, look, it says a lot about a map that when you go to check the highest round achieved on Verrückt, for the solo version, it's 3,365, which is a lot, but if you scroll down for 4 players, it's 36. And while I mentioned that the World of War version was the best version of Knocked, Verrückt is a bit weird. If you're a fan of challenge, the World of War version is the best version. If not, the Chronicles version ends up handling Verrückt a lot more better in terms of gameplay because it gives you an infinite damaging weapon that is useful at reaching high rounds. The Black Ops 1 version only removes sprinters and adds a Winter's Howl, so it's a little bit better from the World of War version. But Verrückt is an unforgiving map. The only real thing you have going towards you is a glitched out perk that works if you don't get cornered, but aside from that, you're pretty much on your own. When I first played Verrückt when I was much younger, I reached round 14 and stopped playing because I felt like the odds were stacked against me. I wasn't winning or getting high rounds that I could boast about. I was dying on early rounds, which was embarrassing. The layout, the gameplay, even the atmosphere felt like it just kept degrading the experience. I wanted to succeed, and I couldn't. I feel like my initial experience of Verrückt is similar to other people's experience with the map. Most people love winning, and if we're not getting that feeling of winning when we play, the experience just feels miserable. For that reason, Verrückt can be just viewed as a poorly designed mess that innovated well and showed off that innovation, but fell flat in utilizing that innovation and was released way too early. differently. The horror was great, but if the gameplay felt degrading, then the horror just adds to that experience. For most people, that'd be it for Verrückt. They talk about how challenging the map is and how the innovations are and just end it there. They'd then move on as if this map was just dust to the pile. And if you're Chaos X Silencer, you'd place it on your top 10 worst maps of all time alongside maps from Vanguard and even Black Ops 3. But for me, I have more to say on this map. With all I've said, it's reasonable for most people to be turned off from the map. But despite the similarities between Noct and Verrückt, there is a positive difference that Verrückt manages to achieve from Noct and from all other maps that make it stand out from the rest. As zombies later progressed, players got a lot more better at the game and reached higher rounds, sometimes just by standing in one spot. Because of that, achieving high rounds on Verrückt is a lot more fun, because you're actively in the moment and you're not trying to camp in one spot. Because of the sheer challenge of Verrückt, there is a constant drive to get better. The game is punishing, and for those unprepared to take on that challenge, they end up quitting early on. Verrückt can serve as a test of your abilities as a player, and truly push you to be better, and the only way to get better on Verrückt is to go through the challenges the map offers. It's also more impressive to reach higher rounds. Reaching round 30 on Verrückt is a ton more impressive than, say, reaching round 30 on a map like Ascension. It feels like a genuine fight for your survival, and you have to continuously strive to get better. In that way, while Noct didn't age that well, I'd say Verrückt's challenge aged really well. I believe the difficulty that you go through on Verrückt showcases the true art of the map. While Noct achieved beauty through simplicity, Verrückt achieves beauty through hardship. Before I began the series, I started to go back to playing Call of Duty Zombies, and I tried to begin reaching as many high rounds as I could. I reached round 40 on Mob of the Dead, round 50 on Ascension, round 34 on Gorok Krovi. I'm not a professional on zombies, but compared to who I was then, I was much younger where I couldn't reach round 25 on Kino der Toten. I think it serves as a retrospect to see how much better I've become at playing the game. Comparing my experience when I was much younger to the experience I had first replaying the map, it's almost like night and day. In my replaying of the map, it was a blast to play, and even though I died pretty quickly, I wanted to play more and try to see if I could do better. And through my hardship through playing the map, I began to appreciate what the developers tried to do with Verrückt. Not many zombies maps actually made me want to do that. I suppose I could summarize all this by saying that my experience at Verrückt represents the player I used to be and the player I am now. And because of what Verrückt has to offer, not just in the setting and the horror aspect of it, but through the actual genuine challenge of it, Verrückt ends up becoming my third favorite map of all time. In my last video, I recommended people to at least try out Noct, even if they were put off by it. When it comes to Verrückt, my opinion is more on the border. It all depends on the person you are and your opinion on experiencing challenges or not. If you hate challenge or think it's grating to take a long time to reach actual high rounds, then probably don't play this map. But if you're in the same boat as me or love challenge, the map is a must to play. Now, I compared Noct and the general experience of Vanguard zombies in my last video, and in this circumstance, I won't be doing it, because comparing Verrückt to any Vanguard map is laughable. I mean, I'll even say this, Verrückt is scary because of the setting, the atmosphere, the threats and gameplay, and the sheer challenge. Meanwhile, Vanguard is terrifying because you have to play the game. For that reason, I can't compare the game, or the individual maps to Verrückt, so I'll now be moving on. Verrückt ultimately became a puzzle piece in an extensive line of other pieces of Treyarch's attempt at creating modern-like zombies. And in the context of World at War, Verrückt partially fixed how vulnerable the player was by introducing perks, but it revealed another issue that Treyarch didn't tackle yet, the difficulty of reaching higher rounds. Because of that, Verrückt ultimately was the map that brought the game close to the finale of World at War, Der Riese, and the perfection of the zombies formula. This leads us to Treyarch's next attempt in the beginning of a formation of a story.
4808N 37.
I hope you're receiving this transmit. The DG2 experiments continue. Might be our only advantage now. Find Dr. Max's. They may know what's going on. The use of 115 is dangerous at best. I'm not sure we can continue here. We've lost most of our best people.